We come to another harrowing war poem, Remains by Simon Armitage, published in 2008. In this poem, we are given another account of a soldier's experience, a very personal first-hand account. But, like Bayonet Charge, it doesn't come from the poet's memory, but rather from his assimilation of real testimonies of soldiers' wartime experience. And it explores many themes that the other poems do: violence and the psychological impact of war, the memory of war, and what it can do to those who experience it long after the war itself ends. And in this poem, there is a focus on the aftermath of the war and the recollections that surface to haunt the speaker of the poem, what remains of his experience, as the title indicates. We will read the poem and discuss what it's about in its context. We will annotate the poem, and finally we'll think about which other poems you could compare it to in the anthology. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, 3 of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story. Except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. What's the plot of this poem? The poem starts with the account of an event when a group of soldiers are sent out to deal with looters, and looters are those who steal during war. And when one of these looters starts running or legging it up the road, it isn't entirely clear whether the looter is running away or towards the speaker. When the looter starts legging it, 3 of the soldiers, including the speaker, start shooting the looter repeatedly. And it isn't clear whether or not the looter is armed. There's that significant line, probably armed, possibly not. And obviously, if the looter wasn't armed, that changes everything. There's a casualness in this opening violence, how the soldiers have become desensitized to such sights as tossing guts back into a human body. Throughout the poem, in fact, there's a disjunction between the casual colloquial language of the soldiers and the more poetic references, the violent imagery of what they are seeing. And that initial casual attitude towards violence shifts in the aftermath of this event, because the second half of the poem focuses on how much the event haunts the speaker. The soldier can't get the looter out of his head. He is haunted by this memory when he's home on leave. He can't sleep, and no matter how drunk he gets and how many drugs he consumes, he cannot escape his guilty conscience after having taken the life of this looter, perhaps unnecessarily if the looter wasn't in fact armed. Let's think a bit about the context. Simon Armitage became Poet Laureate in 2019. Before this, back in 2007, he worked on a TV project, a Channel 4 documentary called The Not Dead, about the effect war has on soldiers after they return home. It aimed to raise awareness of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. This documentary features testimony from veterans and ex-servicemen who have experienced war firsthand. In response to this documentary, Armitage produced a collection of poetry also called The Not Dead, and featuring the poem Remains, which was inspired by the soldiers' testimony, with a prevalent theme of the memory of war that haunts soldiers long after the war itself has ended. The reference to distant desert-like land implies the war in the poem is somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan, but it isn't actually specified. Now, PTSD, anxiety, and depression are common for ex-servicemen. It's a theme we've already encountered in Exposure and Bayonet Charge of the psychological impact and struggle to overcome the horror witnessed in wartime. In a way, we could see the title, The Not Dead, as both referring to the survivors, perhaps accidental survivors as they'd see themselves, who often carry a lot of guilt that they have survived whilst many of their comrades died. But the not dead could also be the ghosts of comrades and enemies who remain with the survivors, trapped in their memory and haunting them long after the war ends. Let's take a closer look at the poem. Like many of the poems in this collection, the title invites consideration. The word remain can be both a noun and a verb. In terms of a noun, it means what is left of something. What could it refer to? It could refer a grimmer connotation, but it could refer to a corpse. We sometimes refer to a deceased body as remains, but it also could refer to memory, what remains with the soldier after the experience. Like the other poems, there are many different interpretations you can draw. On another occasion, this opening makes us think that the soldier is recounting an experience, perhaps even to a therapist. And another occasion, what does that imply? That there have been other, possibly many occasions like this one, occasions that have traumatized the soldier. One of them legs it up the road. There is a lot of slang and a lot of colloquialism in this poem. Colloquial language is everyday, informal language. And throughout, we'll note this later, there's a contrast between some of the other, more poetic language. The slang reflects the everyday experience and communal language of the soldiers. It emulates how they speak to one another. They refer to one another as mate, as it says later, and they say something like legging it instead of running. We then come to what I think is perhaps the most significant line in the poem, probably armed, possibly not. Why is that such a significant line? Because the difference between the looter being armed or not armed is everything. If the looter was armed, then their shooting at him is more justifiable. If, on the other hand, he was not armed, they were shooting at a defenseless man, an unarmed man. And they were shooting at him, as it says later, dozens of times. They were being gratuitously violent. It changes everything. There are high stakes in this line. The poem hinges on this line in a way, because it contains whether or not the soldier, the individual soldier and the other soldiers, were justified in their actions. And the line's importance is conveyed when it is repeated later, when it's going round the soldier's head when he can't sleep. Probably that's his hope. He hopes the looter was armed, because that would make shooting at him less morally reprehensible. Armitage also has given this line a sort of symmetry. Both of the clauses, separated by this caesura, this break in the line of poetry, have 4 syllables, probably armed, possibly not. 3 of which are a word beginning with P. There's a deliberate symmetry there to make this line even more memorable because it's so important. It really stands out. Probably armed, possibly not. Wow, myself and somebody else, all of the same mind, 3 of us, 3 of a kind. Why does the speaker say these things in the second stanza? In a way, he is distributing the blame. That's reinforced by the polysyndeton here, and somebody else, and somebody else. And the polysyndeton is the repetition of conjunctions or connectives, so and. Here, the polysyndeton emphasizes that there's more than one of them. There are multiple soldiers, because it is all about distributing the blame. So in the stanza, the speaker is saying, hey, it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one shooting at him. We all had the same thought. He's trying to make it seem as though their actions were more understandable because they all acted in unison. All 3 of a kind, all 3 of us. And if this looter was unarmed, that's 3 firing against 1. And firing, as it says, 12 times, 12 times. Again, if he was unarmed, that makes that act gratuitous and morally reprehensible. In other words, deserving condemnation, deserving disapproval, because they were firing unnecessarily at someone who could never fire back. I see every round as it rips through his life. Notice he doesn't say ripped through his body or ripped through him, physical thing. He says ripped through his life. It's more metaphorical, and it's a very violent image tearing this man's life away. And the fact that the speaker says life instead of body is a potent reminder of what they are removing, his life. To take someone's life has an immense gravity, a huge weight. And this line highlights this. that highlights the immensity and weight of taking human life. And he's there, sort of inside out. We have this later again with tosses his guts back into his body. The soldiers have been desensitized to the violence they're witnessing or causing. And that betrays how frequently they're being exposed to this violence, witnessing this violence, sometimes committing these violent acts. They're so used to it that in the moment they don't blink when someone tosses human insides back into a human body. Again, you have this colloquial language, which diminishes culpability in a way. There's a casual tone to it that detracts from the act of what they're doing, unceremoniously dumping this body, this looter who might not have been a threat. And between these two casual colloquial descriptions of the man's body, sort of inside out, and tosses his guts, you have the line, pain itself, the image of agony. As I mentioned, throughout this poem, you have this blending of more poetic language depicting violent imagery and colloquialism, like pain itself, so the embodiment of pain and the image of agony. That's a very eloquent image, a very poetic turn of phrase, even though it's such excruciating imagery. So you have contrast in the blending of this more poetic imagery of violence and the colloquialisms. This amalgamation of more poetic language and colloquialism is illustrating the extent of the effect of the war on the soldier. And while he tries to maintain a military bravado, referring to mates and talking about their violence in such a casual way, using the slang that soldiers use to one another, that is not enough of a protection, because still this deep feeling conveyed by the depth of this searing poetic language still shines through, despite the mask of bravado he's potentially putting up. And here's the line. So we have the event. Now in the second half of the poem, we have the aftermath of that event. What is the effect of this experience on the soldier? End of story, except not really. It can't be the end of the story because of how traumatized the soldier is. So this refers to the trauma the soldier experiences afterwards. His blood shadow stays on the street. The speaker is haunted both when he's still out serving, when he's out on patrol, and he's also haunted when he's home on leave by this blood shadow. What's significant about this metaphor, this compound noun, blood shadow, is that a shadow follows you everywhere and you have no choice about it. Unless it is pitch black, you will always have some sort of shadow with you constantly. So it's showing how much the soldier is haunted, the depth of his guilt, because just as your shadow follows you everywhere and you can't escape it, he can't escape his guilty conscience, the memory of this looter he killed. Street, weak. What do you notice about those? There's a lot of what we call assonance in this poem. Assonance is when you have a repeated vowel sound, but it's not an actual rhyme. So, row your boat is an example of assonance because row and boat don't rhyme, but they have the same vowel sound, that O. And here, street, week, and leave all share that same E sound. And this assonance has a bit of a jarring effect because the words aren't rhyming in the way we expect a poem to rhyme. It's neither coming at the end of the line most of the time, and nor is it a proper rhyme. And here again, blink, blink, and bank, you have what we call para rhyme, which is the inversion of assonance, as in these, they have the same consonant sound at the beginning and the end, B and NK, but they have different vowel sounds. So unlike week, leave, and street that have different consonants, the same vowel, this has the same consonants, but a different vowel sound. All of this contributes to the unsettling nature of the poem. So it reinforces the poem's jarring quality. It was the same with earlier Body and Lorry, which is close to a full rhyme, but it's not quite a full rhyme. A full rhyme would be blink and wink, or bank and sank. But blink and bank, that's a para rhyme. Also, there's a lot of enjambment in this poem, but here there's an enjambment across a stanza break. Remember, enjambment is when the line of poetry trickles onto the next line without any punctuation at the end of the line as usual. So, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors. And here the enjambment is across stanzas. And again, that adds to the jarring quality and mirrors the disjointed nature of the soldier's thought, separating the para rhymes that are connected, blink and bank. He blinks and he sees the memory of the looter he killed coming out the bank. And we have that significant line again. probably armed, possibly not. But this time, he's ruminating on this mystery of whether or not the man was armed as he's trying to sleep. He's hoping that he was armed, but there's a possibility that he wasn't, and they were completely unjustified in their killing of him. And there's assonance again. You have the assonance of sleep and dream, and showing how preoccupied he is with his guilt, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Here in this stanza as well, we have those repeated connectives, again, that polysyndeton and, all adding to the sense of guilt and capturing the frenzy of the soldier's thought. Sleep, and he's possibly armed and probably not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. It shows the frenzied thinking of the soldier, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. And all of this, the effect of the assonance and the polysyndeton, it shows how preoccupied he is with guilt. It all contributes to capturing the magnitude of his guilt. Even substance abuse can't make him forget. It's all conveying the extent of his trauma. The alliteration of D, the drink and the drugs, the polysyndeton and, the assonance, the content of these lines all contribute to this sense of trauma. He keeps trying to make himself feel less guilty, but nothing can bring catharsis. Nothing can flush out the guilt of what he's done. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. More assonance, eyes and lines, dug in behind enemy lines. That's a military metaphor and shows how much the soldier has been consumed by his experience of war. Not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land or 6 feet under in desert sand. A lot of sibilance here. Remember, sibilance is the alliteration with S. And that sibilance creates a hissing or sizzling that might reflect the heat of this desert land. And these last 2 lines are really important. How has Armitage made them stand out in terms of structure? Think the whole of the rest of the poem is in these 4-line stanzas. Do you remember what we call those? Quatrains. So it makes these last 2 lines, what we call a couplet when it's 2 lines, really stand out. It shows that Armitage is drawing attention to these final lines. Here and now. So the past event of there and then is suffusing his here and now, the consequence of his actions. His bloody life in my bloody hands. There's the repetition of bloody, obviously. And that bloody could be literal and also the more colloquial swear word, bloody this or bloody that. So perhaps it's both as it continues that amalgamation of more formal and colloquial language. There's so much you can say about these final lines. You've got these pronouns, his and my, that iterate the severity of the war's consequences. His life is gone because my hands took away his life. The pronouns draw attention to what he's done. And he's finally accepting responsibility, not trying to distribute blame like he was earlier. More than that, though, the image of bloody hands is the ultimate symbol of guilt. Think about the expression, there's blood on someone's hands. That expression, there's blood on someone's hands, whether literally or figuratively, it means that they are responsible for a death. And that image, it makes me think of that line, that famous line in Macbeth, will all great Neptune's oceans wash this blood clean from my hands? No. There's something about the image and the symbolism of that. It is the ultimate symbol of guilt to have blood on one's hands. And Armitage deliberately ends on this image that evokes such guilt, this image that shows how traumatized the speaker is and how guilt-ridden he feels. Following his experience in the war, the event with this looter, it leaves us questioning whether he'll ever be able to get over it. In terms of comparisons, you could compare this poem to Bayonet Charge, because both explore the psychological impact on war. Remains focuses more on the aftermath of conflict for the soldier, however, as we've seen, as he confronts his own trauma and guilt, while Bayonet Charge is a snapshot of the war's action and the experience of the soldier in that moment of the charge. You could compare it to Exposure because both engage with the themes of suffering and the horror of war. Exposure, however, emphasizes the inertia of the soldiers and how they're at the mercy of the elements, whereas the speaker in Remains is deeply haunted by his own actions. And you could also compare it to Poppies, because both explore the lasting effect of war. Poppies, however, is from the perspective of the one left behind who loses a loved one in war, and Remains is a first-hand account from the soldier himself who has survived. Hopefully this helped with your understanding of the poem. There are other videos about the Power and Conflict anthology on this channel if you did find it useful. So there you have it, another harrowing instalment about conflict that reminds us how deeply the experience of war can traumatize its survivors.